Thank you. Welcome, Secretary Ross, to our hearing on adaptation and resiliency and the steps that you're taking at Food and Agriculture. Please proceed.
Well, hopefully what we do is so unique. I'm not repeating what all my colleagues have already reported on. But I do want to talk about what the department has done. We don't have the same levels of statutory authority, but there are many things that we are doing because I believe no sector would be more hugely impacted than the agricultural sector when we think about what we grow here in California. You know, it's so easy for us to take for granted all that we have available to us at a farmer's market or in a CSA box on a weekly basis or when we go to a regular grocery store. It's not just that it's so healthy and beautiful, it's that there's such a wide variety of choices for us to choose from because we have been blessed with this great climate, these wonderful soils, with the natural resources that we have and the stewardship of innovative farmers and ranchers to grow these products. And yet they're very, very sensitive to temperature and weather and drought. And so really thinking ahead of how do we adapt and continue to be that productive engine that supplies all these really healthy products to Americans and increasingly to the world is something we think about a lot. So in 2010, the State Board of Food and Agriculture created AgVision, which was a broad-based stakeholder process of what do we want agriculture to be and how do we keep it viable in the years 2020 and going forward. One of 12 strategies was the importance of climate change adaptation. You know, at the farm level, our farmers and ranchers adapt every day and every growing season. And they talk about weather a lot. But thinking on climate is a different level of conversation. It's a long-term emerging thing that we adapt in the field level on a daily or yearly basis. But what are those long-term needs? So in 2011, with a small grant from the Specialty Crop Block Grant Program, we convened a climate change consortium for specialty crops. It was a way for us to bring farmers together with researchers, with the United States Department of Agriculture, Natural Resource Conservation Service, and other experts, and really go through a months-long process of coming to a shared understanding of where we are in climate change, what the prospects are, where the biggest threats were, and what the most immediate, intermediate, and long-term needs were for adaptation. That report was released and has been a very important tool for us in the work that we're doing, and especially in informing the research community. Much of this is around research needs, which can be things as basic as investing in plant breeding and making sure that we have varietals and seeds that will adapt to less water or even into flooding and having to stand in water longer. It's about the needs of equipment and really reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the types of practices that we have. And it's also looking at what can we do to change our farming practices to be carbon farmers and really achieve multiple benefits from the practices that we do have. So in that regard, through the work of the Strategic Growth Council, and I really appreciate the leadership of Secretary Laird in making farmland conservation a piece of that, and to all of my colleagues on the Strategic Growth Council for supporting that initiative. It's important that we conserve that farmland, but the next phase of that will also be to create incentive programs for farming practices that will build up healthy soils and organic matter, because we do know from early trials that by making that kind of investment in our soils, that we will have improved climate resiliency, we'll have improved water retention, which will certainly help us through drought times. If we improve the health of our soils, we start with healthy plants that we're producing, we can also reduce inputs. So I think there's huge benefits for us to improve our understanding of soil health and what we can do in that regard. And that's what we've been charged to do in the governor's budget this year. That Climate Change Consortium report is a wonderful roadmap. I never miss a chance to speak to funders and to researchers about that at every chance that we have. That also has informed some of the requests that we've made during the 4th Climate Change Assessment Research Plan, because we need that kind of work to be done to give our farmers the tools that they need. One of the most immediate ones, and in fact, we're hosting a meeting today in our building with national scientists from the United States Department of Agriculture, is how do we make decision tools more user-friendly and readily available to the farmers and ranchers of the state. We learned that when we oversaw the $10 million emergency money for the statewide water efficiency and energy program that was funded through drought legislation last year. We don't think about and have a easily way to quantify greenhouse gas reductions on the farm. So we put together some stopgap measures to help farmers calculate that. But we're working with the United States Department of Agriculture, which spends significant money each year to cost share practices with farmers to do all kinds of conservation benefits. We're asking them to embed in those practices where it's possible what the greenhouse gas reductions are in that, so that those are readily available and the farmers will just know that the deployment of this set of practices will also reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So it's things like that that are hugely important. They're somewhat small in nature, but those small measurements become the basis for really helping farmers adapt practices that will keep them farming and doing what they love best, which is thinking about how do I pass this farm on to the next generation and make sure that they're as viable as we have been. So with that, I'll close and welcome any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Okay. Well, let's move to the governor's office. We have emergency services and planning and research.
Hi, good morning. Tina Curry, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Deputy Director with the Office of Emergency Services. Excuse me. Thank you, Chair, members of the committee, for this opportunity to talk about what we're doing with all of our colleagues here on climate adaptation. And as our name would indicate, we attend to disasters and emergencies in California, and in all phases, the obvious being response and recovery from those events, but also the preparedness and what we call hazard mitigation, the actual risk reduction measures to make sure that the impacts of those events that inevitably occur in California are lessened. So as part of that, we have embedded climate adaptation in what we do because there is such a natural nexus with extreme weather impacts, tsunami, as the Secretary mentioned, fires, floods, everything, just about everything but earthquakes, but there could be a nexus there too, who knows. You know, the thing being that it's part of what we do. It's our responsibility to mitigate against hazards, and so understanding climate adaptation is a big part of that and has been. So how we have embedded that into our business is we are part of the climate action team. We do work with these agencies on a regular basis to make sure that Cal OES products and planning reflect the latest understanding of climate adaptation. So we work together. We have a chapter in the Safeguarding California. That's a big development in the update. Emergency management was actually featured as one of the elements. Where you know, more so than in the last version. So we're very pleased to have had that opportunity to engage and work together and to learn. You know, part of emergency management is to build in a surge capacity in order to be able to take care of all the things we need to, and that goes all the way down the line to local government and mutual assistance that happens all the time. But we also find that with our state agency family. We routinely work with these agencies to manage disasters and emergencies. So that comes very naturally to us to look at climate adaptation in that way as well and rely on their expertise to get the best job done for disaster planning. One of the ways we have mainly focused on climate adaptation is through our state hazard mitigation plan. That's a document that the state produces as a requirement of federal funding for disasters, but also to articulate our commitment to reduce risks in California. So increasingly, since back in 2007, climate adaptation has been featured in our state mitigation plan. California has done that voluntarily. Only recently has the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, that mandates these plans, actually included in their guidance to all states that adaptation and future hazards be incorporated. So we have led the way for many years on incorporating adaptation in our mitigation plan. And again, like I mentioned, that's a requirement to receive federal dollars, both for disaster recovery if something were to happen, but also for disaster mitigation, those pre-event measures and projects that could be taken to reduce risk. So it's very important. And commitment transfers to local government. We also are responsible for leading the development of local mitigation plans and helping our communities have those in place ahead of disasters, understand how climate influences that so that their plans can be updated and accurate. One of the direct projects that came out of our state mitigation plan was the adaptation planning guide that may have been mentioned already in the testimony. That was a joint venture between Cal OES and the Resources Agency, and what it is a step-by-step guidance to local governments on how they can do adaptation planning. So it identifies how to organize regional characteristics, adaptation planning, sort of the how-tos, so that they can take that and overlay, of course, their local considerations, but have a consistent way to approach adaptation planning throughout California. We're seeing that return in that we are seeing more local hazard mitigation plans include climate adaptation. I think you're going to hear about some of those examples when you get to the local panel. We're also seeing projects come forth that are for that I would say are addressing climate adaptation, in particular for drought, even though that's a current hazard that we're facing. We are, the mitigation projects actually are taking the longer view on how we can reduce some of those risks to drought, knowing that they're coming, and prevent those impacts to communities in the long term. So we're seeing that in our business, just like what you've heard with the other agencies that have testified, that's being taken up locally, which is very important for us because that's really where disaster resiliency lies is locally, and then how we can support that at the state level. I mentioned before we have included climate adaptation in our state mitigation plan for many years as a state and led the way in that. We're starting to see some change happening federally. Again, the dollars lie there, so we want to see national attention to the importance of climate adaptation. So FEMA has now included climate adaptation as a feature that is required in state plans, not just California's, but nationally. That transfers directly to an emphasis on where the funding could be positioned. So we do have opportunities to see hazard mitigation funds after a disaster occurs. For example, the Napa quake that just occurred brought opportunities for mitigation with it, not just for earthquake, but for all different kinds of hazards. So those do exist, albeit post-disaster. But we also have seen some encouraging news. The president has, for a couple years now, introduced the notion of increased pre-disaster mitigation. That's a program that was, when budgets were healthier, was much more robust for in the country, had seen some decline in the past years. But that's an opportunity before a disaster hits, where real projects can actually be funded for disaster mitigation to include climate adaptation. And, so for the last couple of years, and we hope that it's successful, we've seen proposals to increase that. That is something that we strongly advocate for, so that we're not waiting for a disaster event to happen for those funding opportunities to arise. And just to tie back to a concrete example of a nexus between our work with our partner agencies on the extreme heat, and Neil and Secretary Dooley mentioned the Public Health Preparing California for Extreme Heat guidance. We at Cal OES have a heat response plan, really at the tactical level, so that when we have indicators from weather and from our partner organizations that something is coming, we embed a series of steps to begin to notify and help the populations deal with that. Having the long view and participating in the Preparing for California Heat planning gave us a little bit of a forecast on how we might have to change our tactics, what we have to be prepared for in responding to heat emergencies. So that was a really good, I think, example of a co-benefit and working together with our partner agency to understand what might be coming, how that might affect. We have a great surge capacity and mutual response and systems in California to manage emergencies when they happen, but that's going to change, when we see these increases or, seeing disasters present themselves in a different way because of climate adaptation. So we need to know that, not just react to it. So that was a really helpful project that we engaged in together going forward. So there's probably a lot more I could say, but I know we want to keep an eye on time. So I'll end there and be happy to answer any questions once we conclude. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Thanks. I'm Louise Bedsworth. I'm the Deputy Director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and I will attempt not to repeat what we've already heard. I mean, I think we've heard there's a lot of work going on, a lot of coordination and partnership, and so I think I'll take the opportunity to talk about a few things that are underway that have really been able to launch off of that partnership and coordination, the fact that we have a lot of these systems in place. OPR participates in a number of the CAT groups and have really been working a lot to facilitate coordination, thinking about moving from planning to implementation, and really also trying to provide that assistance to local governments. So I'll just talk about a few examples that have been underway that we've been working on, and I'll start with probably the most recent, which is the preparation of the state's application to the National Disaster Resilience Competition. And I think this is worth mentioning because it follows on what Tina mentioned, which I think is a bit of a shift in the federal level of trying to look at how we build resilience into disaster recovery and into preparedness pre-recovery. So in July 2014, the president announced a $1 billion competition that would be run through the Community Development Block Grant Program at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development to support resilient recovery following federally declared disasters. I won't go into the details of the program because we could sit here all day, but California has 3 qualifying disasters, and we are preparing an application to look at resilient recovery following the 2013 Rim Fire in California. And we're proposing the development of a community resilience and forest stewardship program that really builds off the work of the Forest Cat, of other climate action teams, including the Wet Cat, but looking at watershed health, forest stewardship, wood products and bioenergy, carbon storage and sequestration, infrastructure investment, community safety, economic development. All of this through a broader resilience model that we can develop that will be replicable throughout the state and perhaps the whole Western U.S. And so I illustrate this because what you can see, I think, is even getting the point where we are, which is really just trying to develop an approach for the state, has required tremendous coordination and partnership. And so this application has been developed really with OPR and the Department of Housing and Community Development's leadership as they're our primary liaison with the federal CDBG program, but really includes Cal EPA, Resources Agency, CAL FIRE, OES, the California Conservation Corps, the Tuolumne County, and really, very importantly, the U.S. Forest Service. So we've got a very strong partnership that's been meeting regularly, building this approach around the principles of safeguarding California, around the work that's happening through the Forest Climate Action Team, and the work the Forest Service is doing as they're looking at their programs in California. And how can we pull all of this work together, implement a program on the ground that can be replicable, where we can see the partnerships that are needed, the financing that is needed to get to resilient mountain communities and healthy watersheds. So we're in the very first phase of this application. It's about a 9-month process, and we have a public review draft of our phase 1 application out for comment. And I think we're feeling pretty optimistic at this opportunity to pull together a lot of the work that is happening, and really have gotten a lot of enthusiasm both in Tuolumne County but throughout the state in doing that. And so I hope that you'll be hearing more about that in the coming months. That competition was announced as an outgrowth of the President's task force of state, local, and tribal leaders on climate adaptation. Governor Brown was appointed as a member of that task force in late 2013, and the task force released its final report in the fall of 2014. And the focus was really on how can the federal government better assist states, local governments, and tribes in preparing for climate change. And it was a very robust process. California had a real leadership role with the Department of Public Health. OPR chaired one of the 4 work groups that formed the task force and we focused on community development and public health. But California participated in all 4 work groups. And I think you can see the recommendations of California reflected throughout that report. I also think importantly, you also see California examples cited throughout that report. The work of the Alliance of Regional Collaboratives on Climate Adaptation, which you'll hear more about, but the tools the state has developed and the resources that we've invested in, including the Adaptation Planning Guide, CalAdapt, which is the companion program that allows a visualization of climate impacts at a local level. That's a model that the federal government is trying to replicate and also provide to other communities, states, cities, tribes. So those are just a few examples, I think, of how we've really been able to pull together and coordinate to engage in a number of processes. I also just want to touch on the work we've been doing at OPR to really help push this work down to the local level as well. Right now, we're in the midst of preparing an update to the general plan guidelines. These are the guidelines that all city and counties follow for the preparation of their long-term plans. And this will be the first comprehensive update to the general plan guidelines in over 10 years. It has not been, it's been a very large undertaking that has involved engagement across state agencies and with our local partners. A key element of our update is the integration of climate change throughout this document, and so both for mitigation and adaptation. And so as we look at the document, we're providing recommended policies for incorporating and addressing climate change. We're providing best practices and examples from leading jurisdictions, providing links to tools and data, including the Adaptation Planning Guide and CalAdapt, and then also developing a tool that local governments can go to access the data that they need to develop their general plan. And so this includes required data on certain hazards that they need for their safety element, but where we can also integrate climate change information so we can look at future risk as well. The review draft of these guidelines will be available in the next few months. I'll also mention the work with the Alliance of Regional Collaboratives of Climate Adaptation for Climate Adaptation. OPR has worked very closely with the regional entities and in fact serves as an ex officio board member for that entity, and it's been incredibly valuable resource, I think, to make that link between what we're doing and what's happening on the ground, and I will let the later panel speak to that. We've already heard about the work the Strategic Growth Council has done. I think the grants that have been made have been tremendous. Over almost $7 million has gone to climate action planning, and $64 million to urban greening planning and projects, and that we know is critical for community resilience. Finally, I'll mention the work OPR did with the Local Government Commission and California volunteers to design the Civic Spark program, which I hope you'll also be hearing more about, but it is an AmeriCorps governor's initiative that's providing assistance to local governments on climate planning, including adaptation and mitigation. It is now being administered by the Local Government Commission, but it's just another example of be able to provide assistance to local governments to bring the resources the state's developed down to that level so we can start seeing it reflected in local planning. So hopefully that's provided a bit of a flavor of the work that we've been doing, and I'm happy to answer any more questions. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to all of you. Let me start off with a question, because you're all working under the current framework is a couple of executive orders. We don't have any statute, but given that that current framework, and we have our legislation on AB 32 on mitigation, and if there's a dual benefit of adaptation and mitigation, it's a green light. What happens in those instances when there's a conflict between an adaptation policy and mitigation? For instance, if we have vector problems, we increase pest control or pesticide application, or we have prescribed burning in order to sustain our forests, and that may aggravate our air quality. How do we address that in the current framework?
We haul everybody into the same room and say nobody's leaving until we harmonize these programs, and it really isn't too much different than that. We do have through the subcats, you can have a discussion. One of the reasons that we had we've been establishing the forest cat was so that we could discuss some of those relationships between how do you manage your forests and how do you and deal with fire control while at the same time being aware of the greenhouse gas implications and all of that. And so we have been looking at As a need arises, if we have a CAT that can deal with that issue, that CAT can provide a forum for that discussion. I will say there has been no reticence to bring people together if we need to harmonize programs. And if we don't have a CAT that deals with it, we'll find some other way to deal with it, though the CATs have worked with them pretty well.
And I would just add, to circle back to Matt's original I think the fundamental issue is the sensitivity and appreciation that this administration has for the importance of both of those values, the mitigation and the adaptation. Mm-hmm. And so the examples that you used are usually a crisis situation where a decision has to be made, but those decisions aren't made in a vacuum. They're informed by our commitment to addressing the impacts on the climate more broadly, and to the point that Matt made at the outset of our comments collectively, that we are working across lines and we're sensitive to the other issues. We aren't thinking in the silos of our own programs, but I pick up the phone to Matt or John or Karen or whomever and say, let's either pull it together, or this is what we're doing and this is what we have considered and this is why we have to do what we're doing. In the same way with the oversight that you provide and our relationships with you to reach out and let you know when these kinds of issues are arising, either because of your program area or because of your geographic area.
And to add to that, the importance that I have viewed personally is it's not just happening at the cabinet level, although that certainly sets the tone, and I've never seen collaboration to solve problems the way we have at that level. But what we're really doing through the CAT and all those subgroups is really pushing it down to programs. Mm-hmm. It's changing the culture of recognizing with such complex issues, we need all the perspectives at the table, and developing that sensitivity throughout government, not just at the higher levels, I think is one of the biggest benefits that I've seen personally. And I've worked in this town for 25 years, and it's nice to see silos start to flatten a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had to walk out of the previous hearing where they were referring to me as a silo buster, and I was going to get T-shirts made. But it was very eloquently said. I would add one thing, because it is that collaboration, but it's collaboration around what are sometimes really difficult choices. And you used fire as an example. I have CAL FIRE in the agency. You have a choice sometimes whether a backfire will keep an overnight spread of the fire like we had in the fire in Placer County last year, where it went 50,000 acres in overnight. It went something like 12 miles overnight in the forest. Now, if a backfire that was significantly smaller would have prevented that, that's the choice you have to make. In the ideal world, we would prefer to have neither. But we are faced with that reality in some crisis situations, and we try to do it collegially, and we try to make what is the best decision given what we're faced.
Putting aside the issue of a different administration coming in with a different idea, under our current framework, are we able to significantly advance adaptation policies and this collaboration and coordination with the local and regional folks and some independent groups who will come in, or do you need some statutory guidance and muscle?
Well,
it's an open question.
You say muscle. Keeping with the physical thing, we need backbone.
Yeah.
And I think that's the question, is whether there's enough backbone in what we're doing. And we're working really hard because sometimes, and you know, I can't stay after the panel. I would love to hear the local piece, because sometimes local people really want the direction to be able to say we have to do this. When it's very easy for me on a statewide policy level to talk about sea level rise, and then if you have somebody that wants to build a housing subdivision at sea level, they would love some direction that say this is impossible, as we are considering it at the local level, because they're the ones that are dealing with the people on the ground that are having to deal with the results of the tough decision. I mean, I think we have enough statutory authority now, but the question is whether in dealing with that backbone and that types of things, there's some place to go.
There is existing statutory authority, for example, in the guidance that we received from the legislature already through the creation of the investment plan and the expenditure of cap and trade funds. The primary purpose for expenditure of cap and trade funds has to be to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But we've also been given the direction by the legislature to lessen the impacts and effects of climate change on the state's communities, economy, and environment where we can.
That's 32 and all the executive orders.
So that's where we,
It's Matt's
my
Bible.
Bible. Yeah.
You don't even know, he actually raised his,
Yeah.
yeah, but he raised his right hand, he was sworn in on it.
In any event, I mean, we are trying to build that in. So when we're looking at financing programs that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we're also mindful of the fact that we've got direction to find a way, if we can, to also address some of the adaptation issues. And so that's been one of the things that's been motivating as we've looked at expenditures in the CAL FIRE program. It's one of the things we looked at as we're working in agriculture and how we can spend money in agriculture. So we've been finding a path forward. Could it be more explicitly stated someplace? That's something we can discuss. But we know the direction is to try and make sure that we're harmonizing our programs, and we understand that we need to deal with mitigation and adaptation.
And, the governor did, at the end of his first year, a conference in San Francisco on extreme events. It was very well attended. And a national reporter asked him in the opening panel, what do you choose, mitigation or emissions, as if it was a choice. Mm-hmm. And I think he got right on it, that's not the choice. You have to do both, and they are inextricably related. But I think that's part of our education. If he even gets asked that by a well-known reporter, it is not totally sunk in to people. And so that is something that we constantly have to do.